of our folk talk, so it's great to see so many folks here. And as you probably know, that our speaker sure, but Chris sort of initiated all these talks 21 years ago and ran them for the first 11 years. So we just thought it would be a really nice way to bookend the history of the folk talks with Chris, who gave the very first talk, to come and give our last talk. And it'll be on a subject that is really good and it's appealing, so it's not just going through the motions by any means. And I suspect a lot of people in the audience will have been to Vietnam and Cambodia, so this will trigger off recollections. And for those of you who haven't been, I'm sure it will stimulate you into wanting to go. So I won't take any more time, but just thank you very much, Chris, for agreeing to do this talk tonight. It's quite a special night, and it's great that we've got a full hall for your talk. So thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you all very much for coming. Sound okay still? As Mike said, it's been a long run, and tonight I thought, because it's been a long run and because it's now over 21 years since the first talk, I would actually do a very brief glimpse of what the first talk was all about. And just show a few slides. This was us. This was what we had done in 2003, going down to the bottom of Grand Canyon and back up in a day. When I say we, that's myself and my wife Anne. And we started out on the South Kaibab Ridge just after 6 o'clock in the morning, and the temperature was 0 degrees. We set off down. You can see the path going down, zigzagging down, then it goes round that rock at the back, and then you can just see it cutting diagonally down across the ridge, and then there's a series of zigzags which bring you down to a terrace, and from that terrace you get this view down into the inner canyon. And there's a side canyon going off here where Phantom Ranch is. We went all the way down, and as we went down into the inner canyon, we met the mule train coming up, and that was people who'd gone down the previous afternoon and stayed overnight in Phantom Ranch and were coming back up. And as they went past us, I said to the lady on the second horse there, I said, "You look terrified." And she said, "That's because I am." So anyway, they went past, we carried on down. We got down to the bottom at about 9:45. So that was about 3 3/4 hours to get down. And that's Anne dipping her feet in the Colorado River, which was largely snowmelt, so it was pretty cold, and it certainly cooled things off. And then we set off on the journey. We went to the Phantom Ranch for a while, and then we set off on the journey back up. And this is from almost at the top, coming up the Bright Angel Trail. The trail that you can see, actually I should come around and point it out if I can. The Bright Angel Trail comes up here and goes to Indian Garden, which is there, which is a watering hole on the way back up. We had taken 6 litres of water down with us, and when we got to the bottom, we topped up what we'd already used. By the time we got to Indian Garden, we were completely dry. So we were glad of the opportunity to fill up. So it took us, having left the bottom at about 11:45, we got up to the top here at about 5:15 in the evening. So it was 5.5 hours to get back up. And I can tell you we were pretty tired by then. However, the talk obviously went on rather longer there, but that just gives you a brief glimpse into what the first talk all those years ago was about. So back to tonight's talk. As you can see, cycling in Vietnam and Cambodia, and this was a trip undertaken in 2019, just before the COVID outbreak. By way of introduction, just to let you know what it was all about, it was 12 nights with 10 days of leisure cycling, and I underline leisure cycling because this was not a competition, it was not exploration, and it was just a holiday with cycling, trying to see some of the main highlights of Vietnam and Cambodia. There's a group of 15 of us went, all knew each other, mostly from this area, 1 or 2 from elsewhere, but we all knew each other when we set off. So that meant there wasn't a problem of getting to know the group or mixing with the group. The holiday was one organised by the travel company Explore, They provided a tour leader who was with us the whole time, and local guides at certain places where we needed specialist information. Bike hire was included, and at that time we were on ordinary push bikes, not on e-bikes. But the grade of cycling was easy because the Mekong Delta and all the way up as far as Angkor Wat is not particularly hilly. There were times when we weren't on the bikes because travel in the cities, as you will see from some of the photos, was pretty hairy, to say the least, because of all the motorbikes and scooters. So travel in the cities was usually done on a private bus. And occasionally when we had longer journeys to make, we would do the day cycling and then get taken further by bus. So the number of nights there, we started out with 2 in Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon, as a lot of people still call it. And then at Canton, we were there for 2 nights, and we had 2 nights in Phnom Penh. We had 3 nights at Siem Reap to give us plenty of time to explore the Angkor ruins. And then there were 3 other places where we stopped for 1 night on the way. Now, luggage was taken ahead for us. That was also part of the organisation by Explore, so we weren't carrying our luggage. The weather, well, we did the trip in the second half of November, and that was quite important because we made sure that the monsoon would have finished, and normally finishes late October. So we went, as I said, late November. We didn't want to leave it any later because the holidays got expensive over New Year and Christmas and New Year, and also we didn't want to eat into the skiing season. So the weather was generally pretty warm. Temperatures ranged most days from about the high 20s to the mid 30s. So it did get quite warm at times, but often there was a breeze, and especially if you're cycling along, there's usually a bit of a breeze, and it never felt too oppressive. Now I put additional days at the bottom. That is because the 15 of us went out in various dribs and drabs, and most people either added some days on at the beginning or some days on at the end, or in 1 or 2 cases both, to go and either see more of those 2 countries, or even take in another country, or visit national parks which were not on our itinerary. So some people were there longer, others just came for the cycling time. So that's the sort of holiday it was. Right, on the map you can see Southeast Asia. Is that sufficiently sharp that you can make it out? No. It's not. I don't know it will actually sharpen very much.
Just use your pointer.
I'll just use the pointer, that's right. I've got to be very careful not to trip over the wires. Right, this is Vietnam, just round down the coast here. I'm shaking nearly as much as I did on the first night. And Cambodia is there, as you can see. So this is what was French Indochina. We'll come back to that later on. But Cambodia historically tended to look more towards India, whereas Vietnam looked towards China. So there are a lot more Indian influences as far as Cambodia is concerned, and Chinese as far as Vietnam is concerned. Right, this takes us into, just to show you where the full route was, so I'm staggering again with these wires. Right, so Ho Chi Minh City is there, and this is the delta here, this area here. So we go down into the delta and then work our way up to the border with Cambodia, and then on the river boat up to Phnom Penh, and then work our way all the way up to Siem Reap, and the Angkor complex is just to the north of Siem Reap. I'll just stay here while I change one more. Right, this is of the delta itself. So roughly the route we took was to come down from Ho Chi Minh City, down this line here, and we stop at Mai To, and then we go, and the first night is at Ben Tre there. And we cross onto this island here, up this road to Vinh Long, down to Canton, and we work our way up the river, and then we go around this curve here, all the way up to Chau Doc, and then we get taken by bus over to the river and up the river to Phnom Penh. So that's where the first part of the holiday was on when we were leaving Ho Chi Minh City. Right, a few facts and figures. Vietnam is a very populous country. It's amongst the most densely populated countries in the world. Its capital, as you will know, is Hanoi. The largest city is Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, and by most southern Vietnamese people, they still call it Saigon. So it's around getting close to 10 million. The French started getting into the country in the early 19th century. But by 1884, they had taken it all over, so it became then a full part of French Indochina. Jumping well ahead from that, independence was declared in 1945, but that led to constant guerrilla warfare. And I can remember as a child listening to the news on the radio, and virtually every day there was a report on some aspect of the war in Indochina. But eventually the Geneva Accord was signed in 1954, and the three independent countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were named. The North and South division between the two parts of Vietnam took place in 1954, so it's a bit after the war had finished, well, the war as far as with the French had finished. But the North then became communist with support from China and the USSR, while the South resisted communism with support from the USA and France. The USA became militarily involved under President Kennedy when in 1961 he committed the involvement of aircraft and equipment and personnel, but not troops. The troops were committed in 1965, as you can see in Lyndon Johnson's presidency. The peace treaty between the USA and North Vietnam was signed in March 1973, and at that point American forces withdrew, but the war between North Korea and South Korea continued for nearly another 2 years. The war in fact just over 2 years. The war ended in 1975 when Saigon fell. The reunification took place a year later with the communist rule from Hanoi. So, show you a little about the appearance of Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City. And the center of the city is quite pleasant. It's a mixture of French colonial architecture and some very modern glass and steel office buildings. But it's a very lively city. It's very pleasant to walk around. You can see designer makes there, all the high-end shops are all there. It's really got a terrific buzz about it. And this I would have initially thought was a station, but actually it's the post office, in very much the true colonial style. And one of the big hotels, which still uses the name Saigon, as you can see. And this is the main square in the center, a very attractive square, and the lighting there, lighting up a giant water lily, and the water lily is the national flower of Vietnam. Now, this building, some of you would have seen photographs of it before. When Saigon actually fell, there was a rapid escape, or an attempted escape, particularly by Americans who wanted. And they wanted to get out in a hurry, as did a lot of South Vietnamese people. And you may remember this picture, which was in the paper on the top of that same building. So the building, if I go back, the building is there. This photo is actually taken from the other side of that building, but you can see the helicopter rather precariously perched on the top of the building, and a long queue of people trying to get on board. And I doubt if that helicopter would take more than 8 or 9 people, so not everyone would have got out by any means. Right, on to our trip specifically. Each morning in the hotel, we had very pleasant breakfasts on the terrace. But after the first day, breakfasts were usually quite early in the morning, anytime from 5:30 until 7:30. So we were up early most mornings. Now, I mentioned about the traffic and why we went by bus when going out of the cities. And this gives you an indication why. And this was about 7:30 in the morning, so the rush hour was not yet in full swing. But every time we went past a side street, just looking down it and seeing the queues of traffic, mostly mopeds and scooters, it was quite a frightening thought. And even more so in this case, where the lights had actually changed and these people were in a hurry to get across and this tidal wave was coming towards them and we were in the bus watching. It was quite something. Once we got out to the suburbs of the city, we stopped, and you can see there's a lorry parked in there on the left, and that had all our bikes in it, and the bikes were all put out ready for us, and we were each given specified bikes, given our height and weight and so on in advance. So there were bikes set aside for each of us. From there, we set off cycling out through the remainder of the outskirts of the city, and I think through quite a pleasant suburban area where there were some very nice houses, and there was obviously a school nearby, and these children were cycling on their way to school. And then we would stop between every 10 and 15 kilometers as we went, either to get in the shade or to have a drink or buy something to eat. And we were very often stopped at roadside stalls like this, where there was fruit and vegetables and so on for sale. So these are listed all the way along the highway. You would come across these as good places to stop. On this particular day, we were going out to see the Ho Chi Minh tunnels, which again, many of you have probably heard of. So I should have asked right at the beginning, how many people have actually been to Vietnam and Cambodia in the audience? There was a few. And have any of you cycled in Vietnam and Cambodia? No, I'm surprised. We're the only. Oh, did I see one hand there? Oh, apart from those of you who were on the trip. Right, so it's interesting to know that. So we're going to be seeing the country in probably a slightly different way from a lot of people who do it as a package tour, traveling mostly by bus. When you go into this area, there's a clear area where they've got some captured American armaments. Now, the Ho Chi Minh tunnels, these were tunnels dug by the Viet Cong, so they could move about underground. And they actually had about 3 floors of them in some places, and a sort of command module and so on. It was absolutely astonishing. And they conducted the war almost completely out of sight. But one area, as I say, they had these examples of American military machinery which they had captured. There was an opportunity to go down into the tunnels at one place. It clearly wouldn't have been made as obvious in the time that you could get into it. It would have been covered over. But you can see us going down the steps and into the tunnel. It looks a bit deceptive, actually. It looks as if they're quite spacious. But that was probably not much more than the width of this dais here, and probably about 4'6" high. So at best, you're going to be crouching right down or on hands and knees. And I found it pretty claustrophobic, as did several other people. So we came up from that, and then we were given a demonstration of how the Viet Cong could make themselves disappear. And they would know that there was a hole in this place, and they got a cover for it there, covered in leaves. And they would get their feet on the ladder down below, go down a bit more, and gone. And behind them in here are camouflage gun sites. And they would be behind there with their guns, and as American troops came, they would just be gunned down. And we also saw, I didn't put pictures of them in, but we also saw some fearful traps where disguised ground either with leaves or grass on it would have a revolving top. As soon as someone stood on it, the thing would revolve one way or the other. And below them was a pit with spikes all sticking up. And it must have been really, really frightening for the troops. As a matter of interest, in the mid-1960s, I think it's about 1966, the American government engaged Moshe Dayan, who some of you will remember as an Israeli general, to give them his view on how the war should be conducted from the American perspective. And his answer was, you should leave now, because you've lost it already. There's no way you can fight like this. And they ignored his advice. On our way back into the city, one thing that one couldn't help noticing is that when you come into the suburban areas, virtually every property has a business on the ground floor facing onto the street. And these would range from small cafes, metalworks, motorbike repairs, building supplies yards, or whatever. everyone effectively is running a business of one sort or another. And you'll see this over and over again. This is Amazon's Prime Delivery. And we saw lots of, I think this was actually a moped rather than just a cycle. But we saw lots of examples like this where vehicles are hopelessly overloaded. And this was our first crossing of the Mekong River. And you can see one thing that we couldn't help but notice, there was lots of green plants in the middle of the river. And this was water hyacinth, apparently. And because the river was tidal, it would float down during part of the day and then float back up again when the tide came in. The fertile soil on the when you go onto the delta is absolutely amazing. And they reckon, in most cases, to grow 3 crops a year. Rice obviously is the main crop, we'll come back to that later, but here's an example of fruit farming. These are pineapple trees. And the delta is a great fruit producing area. This is entering the small town of Tan An, and our main, well, the route was going through it anyway, but our main purpose of getting there was to have a coffee stop. So our first coffee stop of the day was here, and our tour leader there, standing up with the red shirt on, he was telling us what we were going to do from here on, either that or taking our orders. And then we set off from there, and this is us departing, and then approaching the town of Mai To. And in Mai To, there is the Vinh Trang Pagoda complex, which was built during the 19th century. Now, interestingly, if you look up on Google anything about Vietnam, one of the things it says is religion. And it says 96% of the population has no religion, and the other 4% has either Hindu, Buddhism, Christianity, or Muslim. So very small. So effectively, it considers itself to be an lots of pagodas, and quite clearly use is made of them. So I think the government turns a blind eye to the fact that there are a lot of people who are still religious. So in this complex, there are 3 enormous Buddha statues. I think they're about 40 feet high. There's one of standing Buddha, the obvious one. Through in the background is the smiling or the laughing Buddha. And you can just see the head of the reclining Buddha here next to this pagoda. So that one was about the same length. But it was a very interesting complex to walk around. Very attractive buildings, and we could go into them as well. And the gardens were absolutely delightful. From there, we left our bikes there, and we took our first boat ride going across the Mekong River to Key Island, which is, key is the word for a tortoise. And when we got there, there was a lunch laid on for us, which was all part of the package deal, a really sumptuous lunch. And we sat there and enjoyed that very much. Oh, sorry, it's going to jump on. And then after that, we visited a nearby factory which made sweets from coconuts. And our tour leader here was explaining that although sweets were the main product here, that the coconut could be, just about every aspect of it could be fully used. Coconut milk was used, the kernel was primarily what they made the sweets from. The shells would find some use or other, often as small bowls. The hemp, which was around the outside of the shells, could be used for making mats, and the outer cover, the husks, could be used as a fuel. So it's a product which, and there are huge numbers of coconut trees there, so it's a product which is very widely grown and can be used for all sorts of purposes. And here you can see a girl cutting up one kind of coconut sweet, and these little machines over behind her here is where the kernel of the nut is actually mashed in order to make it into sweets. And here's the shop there where they sell all the produce, and I must say we all bought things there. And then after that we were taken by boat up a rather narrow channel, and we went up there for half a mile or so, and it came to a little jetty where we had to get off. and walk along to another jetty, and then down onto smaller boats, which were a bit like gondolas. And in these boats, we were conveyed a bit further upstream. And you can see the mangrove trees on both sides here. And the whole of Vietnam, even the north of Vietnam, is all within the tropics. The very tip of Vietnam is where the Tropic of Cancer is. So it is very much a tropical area, and the vegetation shows that. And then when we got up to the second landing point, we went to a community centre where we were served afternoon tea while we listened to some local musicians. And I must say the music was not necessarily particularly soft to our ears, but nevertheless, we enjoyed it. After that, because we didn't have our bikes with us, we had rides in tuk-tuk back to where our bikes were, and picked up our bikes and went to our first hotel at Ben Tre. Now, Ben Tre, well, we'll come to a map shortly so I can again point out to you where Ben Tre is. At the Ben Tre Hotel, which was a very good hotel indeed, sort of 4 to 5 star, had a beautiful swimming pool, and as you can see, very close to the river. The accommodation was excellent, and the food there was excellent as well. So there were no complaints about that hotel at all. The following morning, quite an early start, we cycled into the town to go into the centre of the town, mainly to visit the market, a simply amazing marketplace. And the range of produce there was just fantastic. And you can see how beautifully it's displayed. And the fruit here, a lot of these mini bananas, about half the size of a normal banana, they seem to be very popular. Our tour leader often would buy some of these at a market that we were passing, and then the next time we stopped, he'd give us each a small banana, which was always very welcome. And this is the wet part of the market. Remember, the term wet market was often used when COVID started, and there was a search being made as to where it might have started, and the suspicion was that it started in a wet market like this. And funnily enough, while we were in Vietnam, we first heard about COVID, that it had appeared in China and was spreading rapidly. These are spices, big range of spices. So it was very, very impressive. The one downside to it was that scooters were actually allowed into the market. So although it was quite crowded, you had to keep getting out of the way of a scooter coming along. And of course that puts pollution out. So they were a bit smelly and a bit noisy and kept getting in your way. That rather spoilt it. But also notice here that the mum's got the helmet and the 2 children don't have helmets. And then we leave the market. There's still 1 or 2 traders sitting beside the road. They're presumably ones who couldn't afford to get a pitch in the market itself. So for about half a mile or so, we were going past other traders selling their produce. And here's a bicycle. In this case, these are the outer husks of the coconuts, and they're also being taken away to be used as fuel. But that bike was impossible to ride. And now you can see as we ride along, this is very typical of what the views on the Delta were, with very luxuriant trees, coconut trees, palm trees of different kinds, and luxurious vegetation. But very pleasant riding, and as I said earlier on, very flat, so very easy riding. The coconut processing plant here that we stopped and had a look at, and this is where they were sorting out coconuts, taking the outer husks off some, leaving them on others, and they were then either being sent for sale within the country or being exported. This was a cemetery and a memorial for the Viet Cong in this part of Vietnam who were killed during the war. There was no such equivalent for South Vietnamese people who died during the war at all. As we came onto a traffic-free road shortly after that, this was the first time we saw children coming out to wave to us as we go by. And this happened so much. And it was really nice being able to wave back and call out to them. The name of this town, I don't know, but we stopped here because on the left there, you can see people that are going into the home of our tour leader. And he'd invited us to go there and to meet his family. And our tour leader is the one in the middle. And he earned his living by doing tours with Explore, and very good at it he was as well. He spoke very fluent English with a very strong American accent, and his English was entirely learned from watching American movies. And I don't think there was an American movie that he hadn't seen, because he kept quoting things from certain movies and said, "You all know that from that film," and we all shook our heads, "No, never heard of it." He was quite amazing. He had a lovely sense of humour. He was really first-rate tour leader. The chap standing to the right of him was his brother, who did repairs of motorcycles and scooters, and that's his mother on the left, and she ran a small cafe, and we were invited to sit down, and she gave us homemade lemonade that we all thoroughly enjoyed before we set off. So it was a very welcome visit. So here we are again, on typical scenery again, cycling through the delta. And shortly after that, last picture was taken, we stopped for lunch. And after that, some people thought it was time for a snooze. So they took advantage of the local facilities. From there, we took a ferry back across the river. And then we came to see a large area of rice cultivation. And in this case, you can see it's being done by hand. The soil is being disturbed, and then seeds or young plants would be put in place. And that chap was doing it obviously by hand. This chap had a very precarious machine which kept wobbling. We thought it was going to fall off, but he didn't. He managed to stay on, so he's climbing it up and down. And then after only 2 weeks, they can expect it to go about that much. And what you can see just to the right of that would be about another 2 weeks later, by which time the water level is dropping. So they get 3 crops a year because of the constant warmth there. So it's good that the soil is fertile. And another thing we notice quite often, there are lots of ducks in amongst the paddy fields. And the answer is that they were very good at eating up the bugs and frogs and things like that, but also they provide a natural manure. So it helps the rice to grow. And this is a field of rice which has now been harvested. So that's what it looks like at the end of its life. And I took this picture of a kingfisher for 2 reasons. One, because our tour leader spotted the kingfisher on a wire from a bridge that we were crossing, and he spotted it, so we stopped to have a look. It's a bit blurred because I was taking it on a very strong telephoto lens, and I've also zoomed it in digitally. But I put it in really as a reminder that we actually didn't see any wildlife on the trip at all. And this, I presume, was partly because the country is so populous and so intensively farmed or intensively built up. But there are national parks, and one presumes that there would be more wildlife to see there. So we then arrive in the city of Can Tho, the largest city in the Mekong Delta, and either the second or the third largest in Vietnam. I think it may well now be slightly larger than Hanoi. It's certainly quite a big city. So this was it at night, taken from our hotel. And now I'll come back to it just to bring you up to date to where we've got to on the map. So we've come down here, and that's Ben Tre, where we stayed the first night there on Tortoise Island. And we've crossed over and we're now on this island. And we've come up, so I should say we came over and then up there into Pin Long and then down. So we're now in Can Tho there. So that's where we've got to. So then we're going to go up the river and round this loop here to get up to Chow Dock. Right, so the first thing we did when we were in Can Tho was to take a boat trip up the river to see the Kai Rang floating market. Now, evidently there are quite a number of these within the Delta, but what happens here is that the growers of all the produce load up barges and anchor themselves in the river, and then wholesalers and retailers will come up in much smaller boats and choose what they want and buy their produce there. And you can see most of them have got a pole sticking up, and on the top of that there will be something, well, it might be a melon or a coconut or something, and that indicates what produce they're actually selling from that boat. So there are lots of boats weaving their way in and out of all these anchored ones, which are there selling their produce. And then down the side of the river, you can see this sort of dwelling going on for ages, where they're all up on stilts, obviously because the river fluctuates in levels, and they want to try and keep above the flood level. Now I'll put this one in because although it's just a chap apparently repairing a television, our tour leader had a saying. He said, "The British invent things, the Americans make them commercially successful, the Japanese copy them and miniaturize them, the Chinese copy them, but they break down, so the Vietnamese repair them." And literally everywhere you go, there are workshops like that, with people sitting in there repairing televisions or motorbikes or whatever it is. And then one nice thing in my tow was that we could, in Canto, was that we could cycle on these cycling walking only tracks right beside the river. So there was no vehicular traffic except for the occasional scooters and mopeds that would come zooming along and you had to keep out of their way. But apart from them, it was very pleasurable riverside cycling. One of the few hills that we encountered was this narrow bridge over a small channel at one point. And then we were back on the road for a short while before coming to a fruit orchard. And we had a look around the fruit orchard. These are mangoes, and it seemed to specialize in mangoes, jackfruit and dragon fruit. And they were there in vast quantities. And also in this area, there were some lovely flowers, the red ginger, golden trumpet, and canna lily. So from there, back on the path again beside the river. And we're now got away from Canto, we're now getting up towards Long Juan, which is about halfway to Chau Doc, where we're going to make our next stop. And as we went alongside the river, you could see people making use of it. In this case, a woman washing up her dishes. We saw someone else rinsing out a dead chicken. We weren't quite sure how clean the water was. And every now and again we would pass a school, and the children, as soon as they spotted us, would come, if we got off our bikes, they would come running up, and they always said the same thing: "Hello, what's your name?" And when you told them the name, they would chant the name back to you. Ronnie, who's sitting here, got into conversation with these, and because they knew his name was Ronnie, they were all chanting, "Ronnie, Ronnie." And again, it was lovely. And then we're carrying along the riverside path, and in this case, it was going through a rice factory, where they were packaging up rice for local sale and for export. And after that, we came to a crocodile farm, presumably used for making handbags. But when you saw how many were there and what they were like, it was not a very pleasant place. So from there we got up to Chau Doc, and one of the first things we do there, we're now very close to the Cambodian border, and we go on the river to make a short trip, 2 or 3 miles downstream, to visit the ethnic minority group called the Cham, and they are Muslims. And when we got to the landing for their settlement, we had to walk across a very boggy area, a swampy area, and they built this walkway all the way into the little village. And they survived by producing textiles of one sort or another, and selling those textiles. And some were available here, and others were being sent out to be sold elsewhere. After we came back from that, we were given a ride in rickshaws. You can see us all lined up at the back and looking a bit apprehensive about this. But we were then given a ride to Sand Mountain, which is just on the edge of Chau Doc, where there's a number of temples and pagodas. And apparently it's a very popular place for visiting, and it gets something like 4 million visitors a year. So you can see that, I think they're mostly Buddhist temples, so religion is alive despite the government's attempts. The interior of one of the temples. And then from there, the following day, we're on the high-speed launch, setting off upstream now on the Mekong River. And this is going to take us up, first of all, to the border crossings. And I'll just point it out here, pretty much all this, hopefully. So we come down from Ho Chi Minh, and we come up here. We're now at Chow Dock, which is there. And we go over to our landing point there, where we get the boat to go up to Phnom Penh, which is, points out, just over 100 miles. So it's quite a long trip. And with the lengthy delay, getting the visas and getting into Cambodia, the trip as a whole took about 4 to 4.5 hours. As we're still on the Vietnamese side at the moment, and there are quite a lot of activities going on beside the river. In this case, boat repairs, excuse me. And then sand and gravel dredging, which was causing problems because this dredging was removing vegetation and we were getting erosion of the riverbank, both there and further downstream. We're now in the Vietnamese border place where you could change your money into Cambodian money, and you'll notice a huge wad of notes in that woman's hand. That is because for £1, you would get 32,000 of Vietnamese dong. So when you wanted to change money, you've got a lot apparently to hand in to get the Cambodian real is about £1 to 5,000. And so you're going to get roughly 7 times fewer documents for your money going into Cambodia. Here we are now on the Cambodian side, where we're waiting for the visa service. And while waiting, our tour leader had known that obviously we were going to be quite a while. So we went and bought what looks like an overgrown shuttlecock. You can just see it up in the air there. And this is sort of a game of keepy-uppy with this shuttlecock. We'd seen that being played at the Cham Muslim settlement when we were in Chow Dock. But it's quite a popular game. They played on a badminton court with a net. We were just trying to keep it up in the air. And after we got our visas, before we got back onto the boat, the visas were all checked. And then we go into Cambodia. So a few facts and figures about Cambodia. A much smaller country in terms of population compared with Vietnam. Remember, that's about 100 million. So this is less than a fifth the size. And its largest city, again, is about a fifth the size of Ho Chi Minh City. So nowhere near the numbers of people. Bearing in mind also, as I say later on, so many people were killed during the rule of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. Notionally, the government is a parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarch, but actually it's a communist authoritarian dictatorship. French independence was about the same time as it was in Vietnam. And the Khmer Empire, nothing to do with Khmer Rouge, but the Khmer Empire was based in Angkor. That was established in 802 BC, and it flourished until the 15th century. Now, this is to mention that I didn't realize beforehand, you may or may not, but Angkor applied to a much larger area. And we've tended to use the term Angkor Wat because it's the one we're most familiar with and the most famous building. But in fact, Angkor was a huge city which had a number of temples and cities within it. So it was a vast area altogether. It was eventually sacked in 1432 by the Ayutthaya kingdom, which was actually from Thailand, or Siam as it was then. And although it was abandoned, the belief is that some people did continue to live there, and indeed later on, within the 16th and 17th century, that more and more people did in fact move back. Coming back to the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, that was when the Khmer Rouge came to power under Pol Pot. They seized power, they purged the population of its intelligentsia. Anyone who was professional, lawyers, teachers, religious people and so on, they were all murdered indiscriminately. It's not known how many were killed, but it was somewhere between 1 and 3 million. And the city of Phnom Penh was virtually empty. So it's astonishing that you had this huge city with almost no one in it. And the people who survived that, if they weren't murdered, they were moved out into the rural areas. And that created another problem, which I'll come to later on. The Reign of Terror ended when the Vietnamese army invaded and defeated the Khmer Rouge in 1979. But interestingly again, the Pol Pot himself and his thousands of henchmen were never captured and never imprisoned. They just melted back into the population at large. So even today, there are probably still thousands and thousands of people around who were involved in that terrible period of genocide. So we're now back on the high-speed launch, going up the Mekong River. And as we get closer to Phnom Penh, we start to see houses a bit like those that we saw when we were in Cam Tho in Vietnam. And then as we get closer, you can see industry appearing and big docks and cranes. And then we get a first distant view of the skyline of Phnom Penh, with quite a lot of high-rise buildings, as you can see. And as they get higher, you can see that they're all under construction. These are residential flats going up, and as you can see, there are some in behind the ones in the foreground here, all under construction. And this is Chinese money being poured in to Cambodia. And this is us approaching the landing dock where we were coming into to disembark. And I put this in just for you to see a point. It's information about how you have to behave when you go into the grounds of the Royal Palace, and it's in 3 languages, as you can see. But the point I wanted to make was that the Cambodian language still uses ancient script, which is derived from Sanskrit, whereas in Vietnam, although they still use the Chinese Sign Language, they've gone over to the Latin alphabet, which is most used all the time. Now, this is in the grounds of the Royal Palace, a really beautiful complex with lovely gardens and very attractive buildings, a lot of monks walking around. And this is where the point I was making earlier on changes when you're in Cambodia, because Cambodia doesn't make the claim that Vietnam makes, although it's a communist dictatorship. It says that 97% of the population are Buddhist, and that probably is the case. And a very large number of them have at some time or other been monks. And this is the Royal Palace itself. We were able to get into part of it, but photography was not encouraged indoors. From there, we moved to the National Museum of Arts. And just a glimpse of some of the things that were on display. All these statues. There were, in other halls, there were lots of things that came from the Angkor area. And then this magnificent tapestry. And also, this is jumping on now to the next day. The next day, we go to this island. This is Kodak Island, as you can see. And we went up to the point where that road comes in there. And we crossed over the river there on a ferry. And this is us on the ferry going over. And we got to the other side, because it was a makeshift pier, we had to push our bikes up quite a steep hill to get onto what turned out to be a very nice road and an extremely pleasant residential area. And I suspect partly because I think there were probably well-to-do people from the city who had businesses in the city, lived out in this area, and they lived here and commuted by ferry over into the main part of Phnom Penh. And as you can see, some of the houses were really very pleasant indeed. As we went further around the island on our bikes, we saw lots more very pleasant houses. And in this particular one, they had some silk looms, and they were producing silk scarves and silk shawls and so on there, and they were very impressive. And they had a table there where lots of samples were available, and between the girls on their trip, we bought quite a lot of them. And then after that, we cycled around quite a lot more of the island, And we stopped here partly to get some shade, but also because you can see a court here with a net, and some of the local boys were playing volleyball. And apparently on the previous tour that our tour leader had done, people on the tour had challenged the local boys to a match and lost hopelessly. So we were advised to challenge them, but to pinch some of their best players. So we did that, but we still lost. But it was a good way to pass the time and to meet some of the local children. Carrying on cycling back towards where we were going to catch the ferry. Here we passed some monks, as you can see, just walking along the side of the road. More people out waving to us. And then the ferry coming over to pick us up and take us back into Phnom Penh. And all the streets here with the French colonial architecture. Quite a bit of that survives. Now, less than 45 years ago, there would have been no one there. It would have been completely empty. But it's really come back to life now. And then the big new office complex in the business centre. Now, this building here, where we're standing outside, as you can see, is the Genocide Museum. Prior to the Khmer Rouge taking over, it was a secondary school. The Khmer Rouge closed it down. We don't know what happened to the pupils who were there, but they closed it down and they made it into an interrogation centre. And the classrooms are all divided up, and these were the cells where the people in for interrogation were kept, and virtually no one ever got out of there alive. And they were all taken to the killing fields, where the vast majority of them were killed. And as you can see, a lot of the killing fields that we went to, this one here, which was at Cheng Ek, it was estimated that at that area alone, about 17,000 men, women, and children were murdered at this one site. And this is a memorial with skulls of some of those who were killed. And there are 40 shelves of those skulls. It's a pretty shattering experience to see that. And then outside, you can see these roofed areas, and this is where there were multiple graves. And people were just thrown into them. And as you walk around that path, there were several of them. The whole experience was very unpleasant, but very moving. In a way, it's something you have to see to understand what went on. When we started moving away from there, so much of that part of southern Cambodia is given over to growing rice. And it's reckoned that somewhere around between 70 and 80% of the population is involved in rice production or marketing and so on of rice of the entire population. It's such an important crop for them. Another kind of food, insects. And this was an insect market. And there were even scorpions and goodness knows what kinds of insects there. And these are available for people to buy. And I don't think, going back 50 years, they would have been touched. But because the rural population became so much larger when Phnom Penh was emptied, and people were not allowed to eat rice, they were forbidden to eat rice because the Khmer Rouge wanted to export it all to China to get money so they could continue to exist. So people had to turn to other sources of food. One of them was insects and creatures like bats and so on. And they found them very nutritious, good protein in them, and they got used to it. And so a lot of people still eat them. It doesn't exactly look very appetizing. And birds' eggs as well. And then we put our bikes, the van had come and our bikes had been offloaded and were waiting for us soon after we left the insect market. Here we are getting back on our bikes, ready for an afternoon cycling. And we came to this monastery, which was a very attractive building. It wasn't one we could go inside, but we were allowed to look into this, which was a school. And here was a typical classroom with children there, and they all seemed to be very attentive. They always were interested in us, looking in through the window. And then we move on to Kampong Chang, the Cambodia's third largest city. And we're coming into the town. And then strangely, for some reason, the road is now right down by this structure. And as you can see, it's only the width for a couple of bikes to go through. And we couldn't understand why on earth this was happening on the main road until we got to the other end and saw that it was a marquee put up for a wedding. So presumably, if you had enough influence in that town, you could use part of the road for a wedding celebration. We then did a detour through a market, and then came into a very rural area where here you can see the rice crop has been harvested, and the cattle are eating what's left of the scrub, and the farmer is out there keeping an eye on the cattle and seeing how his rice crop is coming on. And then we cycled along an unpaved road, which we had to watch out for potholes as we went along. But this was a really lovely rural area, as you can see from these pictures. There's passing herds of cows, water buffalo herd here. I don't know, but I guess that these lorries were parked here because the water buffalo herds were being taken to market or something like that. But some people have obviously got money to build fine houses, and across the road they look like that. So it was very much a small farming village, and another herd of water buffaloes coming around the corner and presumably being taken up to the same trucks that were there that we saw just now. And then as we carried on, we're on our bus now, being taken a much greater distance, and we passed houses like this all the time, sitting up on stilts, and then occasionally the odd exception, like these really grandiose houses out in the countryside. And then these are examples of pre-Angkorian temples at Sambor Pre Cook, if that's the correct pronunciation. And they were built, as you can see, between the 6th and the 9th centuries. So it preceded the establishment of the main Angkor settlements. And there were in excess of 100 of these built within the forest. We just saw a few of them. But internally, they look like sort of huge chimney with very ornate brickwork. Now, this was being built, in say the 6th or the 7th century. So you're looking at a long time ago, 1,300 years ago. Very skillful brickwork. And there's a program now to restore them and try and get them at least back to the condition they were in about 100 years ago. And this one was particularly grand with an amazing inside. Now this is us in the queue to get our tickets to visit the main Angkor complex. And just for information, it was $62 a head for a 3-day pass. And there's certainly 3 days worth to see. The Angkor complex is like this. Now, I'll try and give you an idea of the scale of it. Come here. Right, Siem Reap is there, and from there to Angkor Wat, that's Angkor Wat there, that's 6 kilometers. This is Angkor Thom, which is the center of it. That means the great city, Angkor Thom. And that has a wall of 5 miles around it, and the biome, which we will see later on. So if that's 6 kilometers, and we go right across the whole complex, we're looking at somewhere between 25 and 30 kilometers. And there are temples, as you can see, several big temples. And we were going, you see Angkor Wat, obviously, then we go to Bante Sri, and we go to this one here, the name of which I'll come back to in a minute, Proton. And then we go in through the eastern gate later on to, no, I've got that one. We go back to the biome there. So of these temples are very extensive, and it was reckoned that by the 14th century, the population of the Angkor area was well in excess of 1 million. So it was actually a major city with huge religious buildings. Now, one of the things that you're treated to when you go there is to see sunrise over Angkor Wat. And this was at about 5:30 in the morning. So we've been up since 4 o'clock to get there. And I'll just go on. If you look, when we look round to the left, you can see how many people were there with their cameras all poised, waiting to take photos. And I was expecting, from what we've been told, to see the sun come up behind there, and then I'd be able to take photos with the sun in it between the towers. But actually, that wasn't what happened. By the time the sun came up, it was off the picture to the right behind some trees, so you couldn't actually see it. But gradually, as it got lighter, the whole area became more and more impressive. And the crowds were still there, seeing it as we got full sunlight. Now, because we left the hotel so early in the morning, we were given packed breakfast. So after we'd seen the sunrise, we all sat down and ate our packed breakfast. And then we were given a tour of Angkor Wat itself. The size, the scale of it is absolutely unbelievable. The central tower is going out of the picture just right of center. And there were 4 bathing pools for the monks, which were at the 4 points of the compass around it. And that's another one. And then there are these amazing bas reliefs. You can see the length of them, probably best part of 100 yards long, depicting battle scenes and other historic events. There were several of these. And then we were able to go up to higher levels on the tower and get views out. And this is looking over towards Bante Sri that we visit later on. And that's the main central tower. And as you look at it closely, you see the very ornate carvings that there are all over it. It's quite stunning to think what the labour force must have been and the craftsman's skills in order to build something of this size and of this quality. And this is the best picture I could possibly get to get so much of it in. It is the largest religious building ever built in the entire world. So it is absolutely huge. And after that, we went and sat beside this lake and had a drink before cycling on to Bante Sri, the next complex. And this one is unusual because it's the only temple of all the ones that was not built by a ruler or a monarch. And it's distinguished in particular by the even more ornate carvings than were seen in Angkor Wat itself. And its unusualness, as I said, it wasn't built by one of the rulers. It was built by 2 courtiers to one of the kings. And you can get some idea of just how detailed the carving is. And over that door that you can see in the distance. Quite astonishing. And then we cycle on further from Bante Sri, and we come to Tar Prom. This temple was built in the late 12th century and early 13th century, and you can see it's in a sorry state compared with the 2 that we've just looked at. And this was for 2 reasons. 1, because it wasn't built as solidly as the others, but 2, because it became overgrown by jungle. And the belief is that there were, as I mentioned earlier on, that there were people still living in the other ones, and they managed to keep the worst of the jungle away. But in the case of Tar Prom, they didn't do so. So the jungle overwhelmed it and can't now be taken away, or some of it can't be cleared away, because if it did, the building would fall down completely. And here you can see the roots of that tree that we were seeing from the other side. And you can see the bits that have collapsed. And you couldn't see much of the inside. But again, evidence of it falling down, and perhaps the most spectacular of the roots. Now, did I put it up as a caption about it's often locally known as the Angelina Jolie temple, because part of the film of Tomb Raider was filmed there. I must say, I watched Tomb Raiders after that, but I couldn't actually see where it took place. After our visit there, we went by bus back to Siem Reap and had a delightful evening there. Not to spend time looking at Siem Reap, though, other than to show that picture, which is quite a common sight. And we get problems here with BT and its connections. I'd love to know how they manage it there in the lab. The following day, we cycled back to Angkor. This is cycling out of Siem Reap. The one place where we had a severe problem of traffic congestion, largely because there was a market on both sides of the road. And we went in through the east gate of Angkor Thom, and this was the walled city. That was, if you like, the HQ of the Khmer Empire. Now this is the Bayon, the Angkor Bayon, which was the main temple built, as it says there, by Jayavarman, who was allegedly the greatest king. Well, actually, what that information didn't tell me was it was Jayavarman VII, who was allegedly the greatest king. But again, it wasn't built to the standard of Angkor Wat, and it hasn't survived quite as well. But it is famous for the various faces that you can pick out on those towers. And also some equally beautiful bas reliefs. And a close-up of one of them you can see here. Soldiers ready for battle at the top, and they're on a boat. And these are the oarsmen's heads that you can see, and their oars are poking out the bottom. And you can see the fish in the water, and you can even see some dead bodies of human beings that they presumably already killed. So it's very detailed about a battle in the past. Here you can see some of the faces that are carved in the rocks. And as we finished our tour of the Bayon, this was the photo of the group of us. Afterwards, all 15 of us, a photo taken by our tour leader. And in the brochures, we had seen pictures of groups like that, and we thought, when are we come to where that photo was taken? And it was the last place where we stopped. And after that, we just cycled out through the south gate, which is guarded by 54 guards, a mixture of gods and devils. And it's the only one of the four main gates which still has all the guards intact. And then from there, we cycled out into the car park, and then back to where we left our bikes, where our bus is, and where the trailer was to pick up our bikes. And that brought our cycling holiday to its end. So some conclusions. The total distance cycled, as you can see, was 331 kilometres, which is about 207 miles. The longest cycle ride was 60 kilometres. We only had one day of that length. There were 2 days of only 20 kilometres, so they were not too taxing. Cycling was really pretty easy, as I mentioned earlier on. There were no hills. But on one afternoon in Cambodia, there was a long, gentle incline with a bit of a strong headwind, and that was a bit harder going. But by and large, the cycling was very easy. As you can see, cycling through the larger cities would have been dangerous, except where there were traffic-free riverside tracks. The cycling enabled us to travel reasonable distances at our own pace, and to stop whenever we wanted to. And this enabled us to get a good feel for what life was like in small towns and the countryside, and to get some understanding of what the local cultures were like. We were impressed by the friendliness of the people, especially considering what they've been through, what experiences they'd had in both countries within our lifetime. If you think Vietnam had that long period of civil war with France, trying to overthrow the French, and then the war with the Americans, and they called it the American War. It was then what we call the Vietnam War, they called the American War. So that was a terrible time for them. But it also affected the Cambodians a lot as well, because the Cambodian government during the wartime allowed the North Vietnamese army routes of access to supply troops in the south. So they were bombed a lot by the Americans, and when they had this sort of carpet bombing in the war, a lot of it was actually in Cambodia rather than Vietnam. So it was great suffering for them. And then, of course, immediately the war finished, they had the Khmer Rouge, which was even more terrible. So they've been through some pretty tough times. And to find these people so friendly, they wouldn't know whether we were American or where we came from, but there was no animosity at all. And everyone was extremely friendly. And as I said at the end there, cycling around the Angkor area with those temples and those magnificent buildings was an experience never to be forgotten. So, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it.
it's amazing. Brought back lots of memories for our trip there as well. So it's wonderful. Do people have questions? One thing that I wonder, in conversations with people, did they talk much about either the war in Vietnam or the Khmer Rouge period in Cambodia?
Not in Cambodia, no, not at all. In Vietnam, our tour leader did quite a bit, partly because his father had been in the South Vietnamese army, although only right at the end of the war. But it meant he was banned from any job that was publicly funded.
Right.
So he found it very difficult to get employment. And he was actually still alive. We did meet him when he was there, but he wouldn't talk to us or anything. He just sat on the bed with his head bowed down.
Right.
So it's really sad. So no, not really. But everyone there, still in the south, calls it Saigon rather than Ho Chi Minh City, as you might expect.
Chris, when are we going again?
On an e-bike this time.
That's probably one place where you don't leave an e-bike, actually. It was pretty flat. Well, some of us, as you know, are going this year, but not there. Frank?
Chris, what did you do about washing your clothes?
Because it was warm and air conditioned, it was possible to get stuff dry. But by and large, I didn't have to wash up too much. I took enough to get by. But we did, I think we did 2 or 3, just put stuff in the shower and trampled on it and put soap on it and then dried it overnight. So by and large, it was perfectly manageable.
They were all equally smelly, I expect. Yes, so.
Was the quality of the bikes always good?
Better in Vietnam than it was in Cambodia. In Vietnam, as I said at the beginning, we were all given bikes which had been ascribed to us specifically because of the height and weight we told them about. In Cambodia, that wasn't the case. Amongst the 15 of us, there were 13 17-inch frames and 2 18-inch frames. And I normally have an 19-inch frame, and I didn't even get one of the 18-inch frames. So the bikes were not as good there. But as I said, they weren't e-bikes, they were ordinary bikes.
Yeah.
Yes, Peter.
Chris, I was there working a few years before, and I was struck at how very uncommunistic it was. I mean, it seemed to me to be very entrepreneurial. Even the health service, I established that you had to pay for a doctor and you had to pay in hospital.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in one sense, the communism seemed to be a fairly light touch communism. I wonder what your feeling was.
I would completely agree with that. We never ever felt we were in a communist country at all, not even when we were in Hanoi. Anne and I and Duncan and Sandy went to Hanoi for 4 days beforehand, and we didn't even feel it there either. But it was nowhere near as vibrant as Saigon, Ho Chi Minh. As you say, very vibrant, and you would never think it was and they don't appear to have any, well, let's say they don't have concerns. They recognise that it's a government and they've got to behave in order so that it doesn't come down on them. But they carry on as if it wasn't there, and very entrepreneurial. But then most of them have to be, because that's the way they're going to make their living, by running small businesses.
And there was a lot of, I think, Chinese and Japanese inward investment when I was there. I mean, they recognised there was a very young, skilled labour force.
Yeah.
So a lot of Western and Chinese influences were coming in.
Yes, well, obviously, because of the long period in which the Americans have been involved in the South, you know, they got very Americanized. But you're absolutely right, it was Chinese money that was going into virtually everything. If we saw a great big new hotel, our tour leader would say Chinese money. He didn't mention Japanese money, but I'm sure you're absolutely right on that as well.
Did you come across many other cycling groups? Was it quite difficult?
No, we didn't. I don't remember meeting any other cycling groups. Do you? No. I was surprised that no one here of those who had been there had themselves cycled. I thought there would be others, but I think it shows, and hopefully I've been able to convey it, that it's actually a very good way to see the country, because you're going at a leisurely pace and you get time to stop whenever you want and to meet people and talk to them. You really get a good feel for it. But it's surprising, I mean, if you look at any of the brochures, most of the companies do 3 or 4 different parts of it. There is one that cycles from Hanoi to Saigon, or the reverse direction. There's one that's entirely in the north. So there are other routes, and maybe other people would have cycled those, but there were not any others on that. And that's one reason why I think the children are so happy to come out and wave to you, because they've never seen the likes of you before.
Okay. Yep.
How easy would it be to go as an independent traveller, do you think?
Provided you were going with a tour company and joining a group, it would be fine.
Actually, just going yourself, organising something yourself.
Having not done it, I can't really answer the question, but I know one couple were with us, spent quite a bit of time beforehand in Thailand and afterwards in Laos. And they were doing it on their own and got on absolutely fine. This was one holiday that on a cycling trip, I wouldn't have wanted to be without the tour leader. It would have been very difficult, especially finding those little traffic-free paths that were going down the side of the river into towns. We never even would have known they were there. So to cycle it, no, but to make a visit, if you were either going on your own, and then you could use public transport, which I think our friends did, or going with a larger group, that would be fine.
And it clearly felt very safe.
Yes. Yeah, I think generally it's safe, and also it's relatively cheap. The countries are not expensive. A really good meal out is about the equivalent of £10, including wine. So it's not an expensive country. Yeah, Kenneth.
Maybe I did it a few years ago. So easy. People are so friendly, particularly in Vietnam, and it's so cheap to get one-to-one guiding. So it's not, and it's safe.
Okay.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Yeah.
Any problems with talking to the locals, language-wise?
Yes. Not all that many speak English. So yes, there are problems. So by and large, things were done through our tour leader if we needed to get something translated. And as I say, he was completely fluent in English. I can't really remember talking to many Vietnamese people directly ourselves. With the school children, it was that very limited conversation of hello, what's your name? And once we'd answered it, that was it.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Chris. That's been a brilliant way to kind of conclude the period of the history of the talks, and it's a great talk in its own right, but a really nice way to finish things.
And Mike, I think I'll just interrupt you there now, because you didn't think you were going to get away without us saying something to you at the end there as well. So just as Mike's saying there, I think that's a very fitting kind of bookend to 21 years that Chris started it. And an excellent talk.
Gesture of appreciation.
Sadly, this is Mike and Tracy's last boat talk that they'll be directly involved in. They've decided to pass the baton on, where that goes after 10 years of organising it. Not quite sure where that'll go, but I'd like to extend a thanks to you and Trace and all your helpers on behalf of everyone in the community hall here. I'll avoid naming all names because the dangers I must miss someone out. But thanks for all your efforts. You find the speakers, you put together a very varied and interesting programme of events throughout the winter season. Not only that, you meet and greet the talkers, you feed and water them, you do much more, and obviously generally you're just there making it all happen. Boat Talks is a significant part of the hall's fundraising, believe it or not. Now I couldn't find out how much we've raised over 21 years. That's a number that would be crazy, I think. But certainly I looked over the last 3 years, and we've actually raised over £6,500 to hall funds just in three years, which I think is fantastic. Not to mention the other worthy causes that we've raised funds for as well. So we've actually been doing fundraising, obviously, for other speakers, other charities, and so on. So that's definitely worth mentioning. And that goes down to everyone who's attended all the talks and contributed towards the success of that. And I think, as Tim said to me last week when we were discussing this, that the impact this has on the whole Strath, where you get a room full of like-minded people on a Monday night, I think is absolutely fantastic. So I think additional thanks, you know, to the talks team who make it all happen. They've don't cry. Too many to mention. I won't mention names, but you absolutely know who you are. I'd say thanks to Graham for live streaming this over the last couple of years there on the YouTube channel. Gives everybody an opportunity to look at it afterwards as well. And you know, thanks to all the speakers from far and wide who have come along to share their knowledge and experiences, and you know, none better than Chris this evening for what he's done. For all the attendees, everyone who's come on a Monday evening, come rain or shine, over the winter time. Not so much shine because it's winter talks, but it's certainly
Snow and rain.
And a special shout out to Team Kincraig for coming here as well. And, great to see you guys. And I think there was four different talkers from the one family here. So, yeah, says it all. Says it all. Whether this continues next year is still a little bit up in the air, but we do remain hopeful that we'll return after the summer, but in some form or another. It may not be exactly the same, but certainly we'll be trying our hardest for that. Now, is Alan?
Yeah.
Rankin, Alan, you wanted to say a few words as well?
Yeah, if it's okay,
Yeah.
if I could just say a sort of perspective from a speaker and the journey that it is from the first conversation to the podium. If I can use a fishing analogy, the first conversation you have is a very relaxed, informal sort of chat, but unaware, a little fly has just been cast and it bobbed in front of your nose. You show interest in that fly, and they strike, and you are quickly netted, hauled, and put on the menu. And it's at that point you actually appreciate the work that goes on behind the scenes. First of all, herding cats, the speakers, their available dates, when they're travelling, when they can be brought in, and how they bring that Rubik's Cube together with the programme is pretty impressive. And also there's an enormous amount of correspondence with the speakers that goes on behind the scenes, eliciting bios, the synopsis of the speeches, the talks, and the images, and then we see that coming together as the programme, the posters that are distributed, the email campaigns, the social media, which is an enormous amount of work. You then arrive and you're very well greeted by the rest of the hall staff, very pleasant, and you leave with a bottle of wine. Which is very nice. But also sitting here as a member of the audience, it's interesting to observe, you know, the state of tension. And I refer to technology, and it's never missed a beat when I've been speaking. But as you sit here, you can sense a slight change. The pace quickens as they move around the front of the room, and then there's a fairly stern look comes on the face, and you realise, hey, there's something up tonight, and the tech isn't speaking. But when the unflappable Graham stands up with a fist of cables and connectors, you know that everything's right. If this is just a hiatus or a break, great. If this is the end of the road, I think the winters will be that bit longer. Thank you very much.
Well said. So without further ado, just a small token of our gratitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. I had a whole load of thank yous to say, but it's all been used up. But I would want to just thank other people in the team. You know, Tim, Frank, and Duncan for helping to find speakers. Bev for the amazing. She finds all the volunteers for the front of house and for the teas and coffees and taking your money. So yeah, absolutely. Therese has been ever present, ever supportive. ever cajoling. So that's great. And yes, but this has been Chris's 22nd talk over the 21 years, so that's pretty amazing. But Peter, you know, there's a long gap between you and the second, but I think you come second as Peter. I think one of the things I'm most pleased about in terms of all the talks was the fact we kept it going through COVID. I think that was really brilliant, and that was all down to Graham. You know, having the wherewithal to do it and get us a YouTube channel, and it's good that we've kept it going afterwards, but particularly during the COVID. So, you know, particularly shout out for Graham. But thank you for everybody who's come. I mean,
Can I just add one thing? When we've talked about whether or not someone would be able to take it on, I know a number of people have been approached, and they very often said, "But I haven't got the contacts." You don't have to worry about that. The contacts just come. And when I started the first talk, there were 35 people at the first talk, and someone in that audience came up and said, "Could I give a talk on something?" And then as the audiences got bigger, over the years, more and more people knew about it. The web went out, and you know, people would come along and volunteer. Well, they would say, "I know so-and-so," and then they fell into the net, and Alan was talking about getting hooked. But don't let that put you off. Because if there's anyone here who would be interested in taking it on, I think Mike's done a fantastic job.
Yeah, we'd certainly be help.
Yeah, we would be here to help. Yeah.
But it would be good to get sort of a younger person who has other networks, so we get younger sort of speakers with mountain biking and boarding and so on. Anyway, that's for another time. Thank you all so much for coming along and supporting us over 28 years. And if you've got a cup, if you can take it out and put it on the table.